Hello and happy Saturday night. Hey Dolores. Hi Kay. Hi Lana. Hey Dolores again. And hi Kay again. Where's Steve Gonzo? Kay saying hi to Steve Gonzo, but I don't see him yet. So there are a few people here who are unannounced. That's always good. Okay. Oh, there's Steve Gonzo, who says, of the 1.7T total student debt, 1.6T of it is federally owned. Yes, I believe that's over 90%. And Steve says that on Facebook too, just to make sure. So the topic for today is MMT and increasing policy space for the states. But to get there, I want to go through some other context first, because context is always important. Lana says, hashtag cancel student debt. Indeed. Cancel student debt. Absolutely. First, let's start with a piece that's from Anand by Giridharadas. I'm sorry, it's actually from the Common Dream staff, but it's about something that Anand Giridharadas said. Specifically, they shared a video from him on what we learned from the COVID-19 pandemic. There's a picture of Anand Giridharadas on Peacock. He was substituting for Mehdi Hassan on May 28th. And the question asked was, can the U.S. change for the better as we reach the beginning of the end of COVID? So on Friday, Anand shared key lessons from the ongoing coronavirus pandemic and wondered whether the collective memory of the crisis will compel the U.S. government and public to significantly invest in care, infrastructure, pursue real racial justice, and embrace an approach to life-saving healthcare that prioritizes global security over corporate profits. Quote, it is possible at this hour to be consumed by despair, Giridharadas said, while filling in his guest host of Peacock's The Mehdi Hassan Show, as the U.S. death toll from COVID-19 neared 600,000. Of course, we know the true total is much over 600,000. But there is, in moments like this one, a possibility of tearing open a hole in the universe and marching through it, unquote. I will tell you some of what I think we learned since the lockdowns began, said Anand. Quote, that childcare is a shared societal burden, not a private good. We learned this year how much harder it is to work, how much harder women in particular have it, how much female brilliance we sideline when we make child care a luxury product, unquote. Quote again, we learn that we're only as healthy as the person next to us. So when they don't have access to health care, we all suffer. And quote again, we learned at the same time that there are no great equalizers, not even viruses, that inequity is a pre-existing condition, and viruses, like so many other disasters on record, hit people according to their position in the caste hierarchy. And there is a video with this article, which I've linked to. We learned that work wasn't working for workers, he added. We learned how our hyper-capitalist grind culture has starved our relationships, leaving us so little time at the end of the day. We learned that when we allow monopolies to corner every market, we become vulnerable to shortages and supply issues we usually associate with the Soviet Union, even as the owners of those monopolies profit from crisis. Giridharadas went on to reference lessons from the Black Lives Matter demonstrations sparked by the killings of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and others. He also emphasized that, quote, there can be no democracy without a shared belief in facts and, quote again, a worldwide mobilization of the kind that will be required to fight climate change is possible. Quote again, we learned that mental health is health and mental health care is health care. That we in America so often fixate on a childish understanding of freedom. We learned we need a safety net that can catch people, that a system that privileges bipartisan consensus over actual problem solving ends up with little of either thing and risks the death of democracy. We learned that the activists our society so often resists listening to, the ones who provoke us, are often pointing us to truths hard to see in the present, he added. Finally, according to Giridharadas, quote, the question before us now is, what will we do with these lessons? Unquote. What indeed will we do with these lessons? How do we summarize these lessons? We might summarize it as Bernie Sanders has already summarized it. Not me, us. That's what Bernie said. And in a way, that's what Giridharadas is telling us as well. It's more about us as a collective than it is us, okay, as individuals. And then here's the next article for context. That one is also from Common Dreams. And it's by Anna Melanow and Kay Tillow. It's a column. It was done on Saturday, May 29th, 2021. That's today. The title of it is Medicare for None, a response to the state-based but Universal Health Care Act of 2021. And there's a sign from some demonstrators from National Nurses United, love it, improve it, Medicare for all. COVID-19 pandemic has laid bare the inequities, inefficiencies, and ineffectiveness of our healthcare system. If there was ever a time for healthcare reform, this is it. But some healthcare activists and their progressive allies, suffering from the frustration and disillusion brought on by the refusal of President Joe Biden and Congress to consider structural reform, have accepted this defeat and turned to state-based reform, jeopardizing Medicare across the country. Healthcare is a national responsibility. To palm it off to states is a Gingrich and Ronald Reagan to shrink the federal government. Based on the historical precedent set by the Affordable Care Act, the story of Medicaid expansion serves as a cautionary tale to those who'd like to leave healthcare to the states. On June 28, 2012, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a ruling on the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act, Congress's attempt to provide near universal healthcare coverage by mandating individuals and employers to purchase health insurance, expanding Medicaid by lowering eligibility criteria, and widening health insurance protections. The court upheld the constitutionality of the individual mandate, but gave states the option not to expand Medicaid, calling expansion, quote, unconstitutionally coercive, unquote. With this ruling, the Supreme Court opened the door to the balkanization of the Affordable Care Act. Those that expanded Medicaid, those that considered it, and those that would oppose it permanently. It gave the southern states a political out and allowed the further racialization of the Medicaid program. Of the original 26 states that brought the case before the Supreme Court, 12, mostly southern states with large populations of color, have not expanded Medicaid. 2 have passed, but not yet implemented expansion. And 3 only did so last year. 1 decade after the passage of the bill, these are the states that suffered the worst health outcomes when compared to expansion states. Non-expansion states have seen worse overall mortality rates, more hospital closures, and even higher high school dropout rates. In 2018, states that did not expand Medicaid passed up $43 billion in federal funds. With the reintroduction of Congressman Ro Khanna's state-based Universal Health Care Act of 2021, we're about to see a similar balkanization of Medicare, the one national program that guarantees health care to everyone over the age of 65. The act, which would offer pass-through federal fund waivers, including Medicare, Medicaid, TRICARE, exchange, and federal employee health benefit dollars to states with a plan to provide comprehensive health benefits to 95% of its residents, defined as citizens or lawfully residing immigrants within 5 years, would end Medicare as we know it. obtaining a waiver under this act does not set single payer as the model to achieve universal health care. In fact, states might choose to go the way of the Affordable Care Act, a mishmash of employer and individual mandates, greater expansion of Medicaid, and more generous subsidies for the exchanges. The act would base benefits on the Affordable Care Act, thus significant gaps such as no prescription drug coverage, limited by reproductive rights, and no long-term care would persist. There's nothing in the act that precludes giving Medicare money to private insurance companies, strengthening profit-driven companies to pursue obscene profits and deny care elsewhere. Now, the U.S. would become a nation of 50 different healthcare tiers, at war with each other over federal dollars. States could band into a region to request a waiver application, putting regions against one another. States unwilling to cover their residents could sit it out, much like the states sitting out the Medicaid expansion, creating yet another form of racism and uneven health outcomes. If challenged in court, this new expansion could be ruled coercive again, quote unquote, giving some states a political out. But this time, seniors in non-universal states would see their Medicare dollars shunted over to states that provide their residents some form of health care. This is the dismantling of Medicare. Proponents of a state-based, a universal healthcare approach believe states can be incubators for change, that ultimately, once one state shows the way, all states will follow. We have yet to see any evidence of this in the United States. And to bet Medicare on this flawed proposal seems unwise. It seems unwise to me, too. The Supreme Court ruling set a precedent that states can use federal health care dollars as they see fit. Instead of seeing this as the problem, the sponsors of this bill see it as an opportunity to compromise, allow southern states to gut Medicare while allowing more progressive states to have universal health care. The U.S. doesn't need to dismantle Medicare. It needs to improve it and expand it to every person. The country must replace its broken, fragmented, profit-driven, and racist system with a universal, affordable, accountable, comprehensive, evidence-based, equitable, single-payer national Medicare for all, not Medicare for none. Every resident of every state deserves this. This is something on which we can all agree. I hope we can all agree on it. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that we can all agree on it. If we could all agree on it, would not we have all the states thus far expanding Medicaid? I do agree that enough of us can agree upon it, that we can pass Medicare for all nationally, and that is the preferable way to go. But now, in the context of these two pieces we just have gone through, I want you to consider a discussion that started on Twitter yesterday. The discussion was about how relevant MMT was at the state level. Also, another question was, do state-level politicians have to know about MMT? Why is it relevant for them to know about MMT? Here are some thoughts on that subject. Let me share some briefing charts with you on that. Why should state-level candidates and office holders know MMT? Well, for one thing, MMT is important for understanding the limitations of state and local level government compared to the monetarily sovereign federal government. That is, it's important that people know up front that the federal government, since it is a monetary sovereign, can produce, can create, does create, in fact, however much money it needs to meet what it considers to be its obligations of the moment. It creates that money, but state and local level government cannot do that. State governments understanding the capabilities of monetary sovereign governments are in a far better position to recognize the obligations of the federal government to the states and to the people, and to pressure the federal government to fulfill those responsibilities. Now, I'm no longer talking about the obligations that the people who run the federal government think they have to the states, and to the people. I mean, we know what they think. We know that lots of people who are running the federal government do not believe they have much in the way of obligations to state and local governments, and also to the people of America. But once the people in state government and the people in local governments understand the full capabilities of monetary sovereign governments such as the federal government, then those people can recognize that since the federal government going into a federal system basically involved the component parts, the states themselves, giving away their monetary sovereignty to the federal government, they can recognize that the federal government, having that monetary sovereignty, has obligations to the states, to the localities, and to the people to heal the problems, to solve the problems that are created for the states, because they have no monetary sovereignty. the monetary sovereign has obligations to its component parts to achieve the public purpose in those states and in those local governments, because it has taken away a critical power from those subdivisions that would have enabled them to meet their obligations and their responsibilities. For example, wasn't it a travesty that the CARES Act gave so little assistance to states compared to the help it gave to businesses and to individuals? But of course, mostly to big businesses, some lesser amount to small businesses. But it gave the least amount of help that came out of the CARES Act to the states and localities, which the federal government had taken monetary sovereignty from. What kind of travesty is it? What kind of foolishness is it for the federal government to think it has greater obligations to help big business during the economic hardships, of COVID than it had to help the states and localities whose sources of revenue from taxes were so hard hit by the crisis? The federal government, as the currency issuer, certainly should have backed states on terms at least as generous as those offered to big business. And perhaps should have given, I certainly think it should have given, more generous terms to the states. More generous terms to the states, because the states have ongoing obligations. And if the economy crashes as a result of an emergency, which forces the federal government and the state governments to restrict the tax revenue coming into the states, surely the federal government had an obligation from the get-go to make that good. And yet, it did not. The states got very little help from the CARES Act, very little help from the second round of stimulus, and are only getting some more substantial help now from the American Rescue Plan. But even then, it's not enough. It doesn't make the states whole. Why shouldn't the federal government have had the obligation? I think it did have the obligation. Why should it not have recognized its obligation to make the state's level of revenue constant during the economic crisis, so no state employees would have had to have lost their jobs? I never understand why people can't see this obligation. It is so plain to me. On my next slide, dealing with further federal obligations to the states. In the ongoing crisis, the federal government, as the currency issuer, certainly should back states on terms at least as generous as those offered to big business. Furthermore, one big reason why Medicare for All doesn't exist here yet is that most states can't afford it. Some states certainly would have passed a Medicare for All bill if it wouldn't have caused them financial problems. Vermont would have passed such a bill. Pennsylvania would have passed such a bill, judging from the level of support in Pennsylvania for it. Also, Minnesota would have passed such a bill. California, Oregon, and Washington would all have passed such bills. Why haven't they passed a Medicare for All bill? Why haven't they passed state versions of H.R. 1976? Because tax revenues will not cover it. So I ask, why shouldn't the federal government just pay the bills? After all, the states gave up their monetary sovereignty by accepting the Constitution. If the states can't afford to pay for the vital services of health care to all who want it, if the states cannot fund that because they are not monetary sovereigns, then doesn't the federal government have the obligation to fund it? I think it certainly does if a state government should make that particular choice. So next, how else can the federal government help out the states? Well, the federal government can help out the states. It can help out the states through revenue sharing. In the 1970s, we used to have revenue sharing programs. Why aren't the state governments pressuring the federal government through these state associations? Why aren't they pressuring the federal government to fund programs that states cannot afford, but that are in accordance with the public purpose of states? States that understand MMT, understand that the federal government is a monetary sovereign, can suggest all sorts of ways that the federal government can and should help them and their citizens out. For example, why not federal revenue sharing for infrastructure? Not all of infrastructure is handled by the federal government. That's been a traditional function for the states. Why don't we have a federal revenue sharing program for infrastructure? Why haven't we had one for years and years and years, running through the Department of Transportation? Why haven't we had federal revenue sharing funds for education? I think there have been some, but those programs have suffered greatly over the years. How about federal revenue sharing programs designed to eliminate poverty in the states? What's wrong with those? How about programs for eliminating state level taxation? State level taxation is much more regressive in general than federal income taxation is. But that's not really the point here. The point here is that the federal government has the power to support state programs that it wishes to support by just granting the states the cost of those particular programs without any necessity for the states to gather tax revenue to pay for those particular programs. If taxes need to be levied to contain inflation, why can't the federal government do that on a uniform basis across the country? Why not? Why do we have to have the crazy quilt of state by state taxation following different principles across the country? Why is that an advantage? The federal government can certainly afford to pick up the state level budget because it's a monetary sovereign. Why can't we have the federal government actually do that? Why can't we have the states actually lobbying for the federal government to do more of that so that the states themselves don't have to tax? There are lots of other things that the federal government can do for the states using revenue sharing programs. Why aren't the state governments lobbying for that? You get the idea. States that understand MMT can suggest all sorts of ways that the federal government can and should help them and their citizens out. Let's brainstorm that for a time. So, I'm calling on you now. What are some of the things the federal government can fund for the states? What are some of the things that might usefully be passed through the states? And what are some of the problems that we're going to encounter in designing programs of this sort? I'm putting that to you. But I'm also pointing out that the main point is here is that if governments in the states understand the full power of the federal government to finance state level programs, then it seems to me the states ought to be at the throat of the federal government every single year for funding for state level programs that the states can't afford. Why not? What's wrong with that? So, what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to come to your comments, give you some time to make some suggestions, and then catch up to you. Kay says, I saw that last night. You saw what last night? Oh, the student debt probably. Steve Gonzo said, by Red Berets to Medicare for All are arguing with MMTers about us undermining their push for state by state Medicare for All. Well, it's not MMT that is undermining state by state Medicare for All. MMT is perfectly consistent with that. I think that what some of the MMTers are arguing about is the same thing that was covered in the article that we just went through. Okay, if Medicare funds are funneled through the states for them to do with as they please, that would spell the end of the Medicare program. I certainly wouldn't want to do that. What I would want to do instead is to further extend the federal Medicare program to more people. While also extending the ability to the states to pass state-level Medicare for All programs for people not yet covered by the federal Medicare for All program. In other words, if the eligible age for the federal Medicare for All program is lowered to 55, then I'd be all for the states putting in proposals for Medicare for All programs for the rest of the populations of their states to be funded by the federal government. I don't see anything wrong with that. Steve Gonzo says, our analysis has concluded you exhibit disruptive tweet activity and recommend caution when interacting with my account. Apparently, I'm disruptive, though not quite problematic on Twitter, according to botsentinel.com, analyzed accounts all. That's Twitter playing games again. Kay says, Medicaid in Ohio is made to keep you poor. Steve Gonzo says 11 GOP senators are currently out of town, but Democrats could end the filibuster with a single vote right now. But that's really astonishing. So what you're basically saying is that there are only 39 GOP senators who can make a quorum call. Well, I presume that most of the Democrats could make a quorum call. So if you could get 45 Democrats at this point to vote to end the filibuster, to use the nuclear option on the filibuster right now, we could be rid of the filibuster tomorrow while these other folks are out of town. Well, for my money, Chuck Schumer, that's exactly what you should do. Kay says, maybe not with Manchin and Sinema, Steve Gonzo. Look, but if only 39 of the GOP senators, are in town, and you add Manchin and Sinema to that total, you've got only 41 votes for retaining the filibuster. If you have more Democrats who are in D.C. right now, who are willing to vote to get rid of it, then they can do it with 42 votes. Certainly, they could probably do it with 48 or 49 votes if all those other senators are in town. Kay says, we need D.C. to be a state. More Dems in the Senate. Yeah, we do need D.C. to be a state. We probably have enough votes now to push it through. If we have 11 Republicans who are out of town, there probably are enough votes to push it through right now. So Lana says, the federal government also likes to mandate things and then doesn't fund their mandates to the states. It's absurd. Absolutely, if the federal government wants to mandate things, it should be mandated by law to fund those things. Now 23 states are going to halt the federal dollars for unemployment early. The usual states are on the list, except I was surprised to see New Hampshire. Yeah, now that can be stopped just by the federal government taking over the unemployment program and not actually running that through the states. Kay says states' rights suck bad. Lana says, what about block grants to the states with a minimum amount per person, for Medicare for all? Actually, revenue sharing often worked through giving block grants to the states. The problem is that those block grants have to be specified for a particular purpose. I wouldn't be in favor of necessarily giving a fixed amount to the states. I would be in favor of giving them a grant for what they actually spend on their Medicare for All program. Now, I don't just want to give a blank check. So there should be various cost controls involved, in return for that. Sure, I completely agree. But there's no reason why the states should up front be restricted to a particular amount when we don't yet know what they are likely to be spending. Lana says the state-by-state Medicare for All people refuse to get the difference between the state and federal funding. And they blame MMTers for not getting behind the idea. The case says that block grants they usually don't work. I don't know if that's true as a blanket statement, Kay. Some of the block grant programs during the 1970s were actually a big help to the states. The HUD block grants, for example, were a big help to the states. But then the federal government started crying poverty. They didn't work because the federal government was unwilling to fund the whole thing. They wanted a cost share with the states. I don't think there should be cost sharing with the states for vital services such as healthcare services. Carmen said, so late, I need to give myself a whooping. Laugh out loud. Hi, folks. Hi, Hulk and Bonnie. Hi, Carmen. Okay, so I'd like to see some more brainstorming on that. But while you brainstorm, I'm going to go on to the next piece here. That's my slide 4. Oh, I guess I showed you that before. That was the slide that said, let's brainstorm the various ways that the states can help. So that brings us to my concluding slide on this. My concluding slide for now. I think the federal government can help state public banks. Only one state has a public bank now, famously the Bank of North Dakota. I think state banks can benefit tremendously by being part of the Federal Reserve System and being part of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation program. Why not? Why should private commercial banks have that kind of privilege, have that kind of protection from the Federal Reserve, from the government, that is, while state public banks don't have that protection? Now, the Bank of North Dakota has a special relationship with the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Bank, but it's not a full-blown part of the Federal Reserve system, so that it's under the regulation of the Federal Reserve System. Now, state banks would actually be much safer than the private commercial banks because the state banks are well capitalized by the pension funds of the states, so that their loan to capital ratio is very, very good. And that's quite important for bank stability, much more important than the loan to reserve ratio. So state banks can be very stable banks. But there's no reason for states to have to take a chance on their stability. Why shouldn't their stability be guaranteed by the Federal Reserve System? I certainly think it should. I think we should have immediate state banks started in all the states to keep the private commercial banks honest as competitors for the private the commercial banks. And they too, like the commercial banks, should be part of the Federal Reserve System and the FDIC program. And if necessary, so can postal banks be part of the Federal Reserve System. It isn't entirely clear to me whether that's needed right now, but certainly it's another way the federal government can help out the states with its unlimited power of monetary sovereignty. So let's go back to your comments now and see if you have any more about other ways in which the states can be helped. Kay says, I like postal banks. Warren Mosler was explaining about lack of FDIC for state banks and they are loaning out deposits. Not cool. I'm not sure they really were loaning out the deposits in that. I suspect that it wasn't so much that they're loaning out the deposits as if they were ever to become stable, then their deposits, rather than just their capital, would have to back up the state banks. And that is not cool. But, I mean, I don't see why the state banks, when they make a loan to somebody, I don't see why they're not simply marking up, the deposit accounts of those entities. Okay. It seems to me they are. And it seems to me that's backed by some ratio, of the loan deposits to the capital that has been accumulated by the state banks. And the state bank of North Dakota, that has a tremendous amount of capital because it's been profitable every year since it was started in 1918. I think it was started in 1918, if I recall correctly. It's more than 100 years old. It's got plenty of capital, in back of it. With the size of the pension funds in California, there would be just a huge amount of capital just coming from profit from loans, shortly coming to the State Bank of California if they had one. It would take a few years to accumulate that capital because the capital isn't the pension funds themselves. Those are the deposits that come into the bank. But once the state banks do start with their loan business, that loan business can be so huge that in a very short time, their capital base will be very strong. So, certainly though, I do want to underline the point that if the state banks were backed by the FDIC and were also part of the Federal Reserve System, then they certainly wouldn't be loaning out their deposits, would they? They'd be very, very safe. Kay says, we used to have local banks when I moved to North Carolina. They've all been privatized. I think those local banks were always private banks. I think what you mean is that they've all been bought up by larger banks, or by commercial banks, and the old local private savings banks that used to exist in all small communities here in the United States, that you don't find those anymore. I don't even think you find too many small commercial banks, because after they've operated for 5 or 10 years, they're usually quickly snapped up by some giant bank. Okay, so the main point that I wanted to make tonight is that state governments need desperately to recognize that the federal government has the capability to help them all out financially to a tremendous degree with respect to all kinds of state functions. And for some reason, the state governments are not there in Washington lobbying for that. Lobbying for that. Going to see Congress people and telling them they want this from the federal government and that from the federal government and the other thing from the federal government. And that they expect the Congress people to vote for that. Because if they don't vote for that, they're going to hear from state government employees. I think state government employees have a lot of voting power in states across the country. State and local governments employees have a lot of voting power. They should have a table. They should get their share of the proceeds coming from the monetary sovereignty of the federal government. That's what I'm saying. I'm saying that most state-level office holders and candidates just are not thinking in those terms. Even when he says, yeah, why don't states lobby in D.C.? Is that taboo? No, it's not taboo. During the 1970s, they were lobbying all the time here. There's a building downtown in D.C. It's called the Hall of the States, and it's got voluntary associations in it, including state associations of which all the states are members. And they do lobby the federal government now, but they don't seem to realize that they can lobby the federal government for multiple times the revenue they're getting from the federal government now. All they have to do is do it. All they have to do is understand that it is legitimate for them to do it. The ideology of neoliberalism has taught them over a period of years that they're supposed to be self-sufficient, to always balance their own budgets, and not have any deficit spending policy space. What I'm saying here is no. The policy space of states should be increased by the federal government in return for the grant by the states of monetary sovereignty to the federal government. Since there was that grant, it's completely legitimate for the states to be in Washington, D.C. with their hands out all the time to help with state finances. And I'm also saying that I would like to see that. I would like to see that. All states should be doing that. And I think that would greatly improve the capacity of states and the willingness of states to provide services to the people, and would bring the states, once again, much closer to the people, because state governments would be much more aware of the needs of the people. Lana says, I was thinking that their lending capacity would be low, but I need more info. when I approve and close a mortgage with my current employer, no one's deposit is at risk. It's separate. Yep, that's right. Their lending capacity is probably relatively low right now, though in the case of the Bank of North Dakota, uh, it's probably much greater because of all the profits they've accumulated over the years. But yes, the lending capacity of state banks would be lower than that of commercial banks if they're not part of the Federal Reserve system, because the deposits would not necessarily be entirely separate from the loans. Whether they are or not depends upon the amount of capital the state banks would have, because the capital would first serve as the backstop if anything happened before things got to the level of the deposits being at risk. But of course, if they were part of the Federal Reserve System, then the deposits would never be at risk. Kay says, my bank was bought up by South State Bank. Now they want me to pay $8 a month for a balance under $1,500. Shake my head. But I can't have over $2,000 or Medicaid is gone for me in Ohio. It's irritating, I know. Evelina says, so that's it. But neoliberal brainwashing of the states. Yes, there has been neoliberal brainwashing of the states because somehow the governors feel they shouldn't be feeding at the federal trough. What I'm saying is the big businesses are feeding at the federal trough. The small businesses are trying to feed at the federal trough. There's absolutely no reason why the state should not be feeding at the federal trough. They have more reason to be feeding at the federal trough. Much more reason. And much more reason to get things from the federal government. That's the main point that I'm trying to make tonight. We all have to start brainstorming how the federal government can and should help the state with respect to its programs. Now, there could also be federal programs too. I would say certainly federal programs are needed in those areas where the states are allowing racism to motivate what they're doing. Yes, there's a need for federalization in all of those areas. Certainly. I'm not advocating that there should not be federalization, nor am I for the idea that Medicare funds should be turned over to the state for them to do what they will in relation to their own healthcare systems. No. If Medicare funds are going to be turned over to the states, I'm not sure I want to see that at all, but if I were to see it, then I would say that those funds would have to be earmarked only for the Medicare program in those states, only for the Medicare for All program that's in those states where the federal government is guaranteeing the full expenditures of those Medicare for All programs. Hey, Steve, how are you? Long time no see. We've missed you. I've certainly missed you. Evelina says, most people don't want to learn it. Well, we have the educational problem, folks. We're always going to have the educational problem. Okay, before I run out of time now, I want to leave this and do one more thing outside of the main topic, of the evening. Steve says, how does a national emergency turn into states are on your own free-for-all? Donald Trump is one answer. He explicitly did that because he wanted to avoid responsibility for bad outcomes for COVIDs. So he tried to turn over the responsibility entirely to the state and say, Not a federal problem. Evelina says, but New York State is an example of a state not to emulate, perhaps. Steve Wolfbrand says, I've missed you all as well. Thank you, Steve. Evelina said, I didn't say people don't want to learn. That was someone else, Joe. Yeah, I think that was Kay, wasn't it? I'm sorry, I think that Kay said people don't want to learn. No, did Kay say that? Yeah, Kay said, Evelina, most people don't want to learn it, right? That was someone else. Yes, Kay said, yes, that was me. And I think that's true, that most people don't want to learn it. Okay, anyway, going on to the next topic. There was, I thought, an interesting proposal that appeared in Common Dreams that I think we ought to take in and attend to. So let's look at that post before we finish up for the night. Here's how to end the filibuster and protect democracy. This is from May 28, Common Dreams. The author is Mr. Miles Mogulescu. Is he a mister or is he a doctor? I don't know. Anyway, there's a picture of progressives wanting to end the filibuster. There's Pramila Jayapal and Cori Bush and what looks like Joe Neguse back there in the back. I am not sure who this is. Or this is Jan Schakowsky, though, on the end. Calling for the end of the filibuster on April 22nd. Anyway, Miles says, Code Red, unless the filibuster is eliminated, at the very least it pertains to voting rights and civil rights laws. What's left of American democracy is dead. The Republicans will suppress the vote and gerrymander elections to guarantee a Republican Congress, President, and Supreme Court of, by, and for the minorities. He's right. The best defense is a good offense. Passage of the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and the For the People Act would block most voter suppression tactics, but prevent politicians from picking their own voters through partisan gerrymandering and reduce the influence of big money on politics. I don't think that's completely true because there are voter suppression tactics with respect to third-party voting that would continue to survive and actually be strengthened by the passage of those two acts. But if we're just talking about the two parties, yes, that's correct. The bills are supported by majorities in the House and Senate, but passage in the Senate requires a 60-vote supermajority, of course, because it's the filibuster threshold. So far, Democratic Senators Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema are opposing getting rid of the filibuster, leaving Democrats 2 votes short. That's not necessarily correct. We don't know if Manchin and Sinema are really the only 2 votes. Some indication that there might be more votes was given by the 8 people who defected from the Fight for 15, who defected from the Bernie Sanders amendment. Now, I don't believe all eight of those are against getting rid of the filibuster, but there might be another 1 or 2 besides Sinema and Manchin who would not vote for getting rid of the filibuster. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that they're the only 2. When the rubber hits the road, quoting from the article, Manchin and Sinema will have to decide if an antiquated Senate tradition or the preservation of American democracy is more important to them. It will take a carefully constructed, step-by-step strategy by the Senate leadership in coordination with grassroots organizations to potentially bring Manchin and Sinema around. For purposes of this article, I assume that if Manchin comes around, so will Sinema, since she won't want to be the sole Democrat blocking voting rights. Well, actually, I would not put it past her, but that might be right. Here's how such a strategy might play out. Step one, an interim step. Make senators keep speaking if they want a filibuster. What he's calling for here is he's calling for a rules change, not to end the filibuster, but to restore the talking filibuster as it used to exist. Keep the supermajority of 60, but make everybody who wants to filibuster actually talk, not simply send an email in saying that they are filibustering. And filibusters are now secret, anonymous, and silent, says the article. There are no daily TV clips of senators holding forth for days on end, reading children's books out loud in the Senate chambers and wearing diapers. There are rarely any mass mobilizations to break the filibuster, since most of the country doesn't know what's happening. So a first interim step to limiting the filibuster is to go back to the old-fashioned talking filibuster. This can be enacted by a simple Senate majority vote, since even Joe Manchin has indicated support for going back to a talking filibuster. The 50 Democratic senators plus VP Harris can do it just by voting for a procedural motion. This is true. They can do that. Why don't they immediately do that? That should work. I think Manchin has indicated enough times, and Sinema as well, that they are in favor of the talking filibuster. So make them go on the line for the talking filibuster. That is step one. Then step two, bring the John Lewis Voting Rights Act to the Senate floor. While it's not as comprehensive as the For the People Act, which outright prohibits most voter suppression tactics and eliminates gerrymandering, the John Lewis Act restores key provisions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, requiring that states with a history of racial voting discrimination get pre-clearance from the Justice Department before changing their voting laws. In fact, Joe Manchin has suggested expanding the John Lewis Act so that all 50 states, not just historically Jim Crow Southern states, would be subject to pre-clearance of voting law changes to be sure that they don't discriminate on racial lines. In addition, the law should be made retroactive to Election Day 2020, so that voter suppression laws like those recently passed by Georgia and Texas would be subject to pre-clearance. I'm wondering if that, is legal. It seems like that would fall under the heading of an ex post facto law. I don't think there is an ability to cancel the new voter suppression laws passed by Georgia, and Texas. What could be done is to pass a separate bill that would simply rule those laws, as illegal. In other words, not, in any way retroactive, but just pass a federal law to override the Georgia, and Texas laws. Not the actual John Lewis Act, but a very simple law. If you've got the 50 votes for the John Lewis Act, he certainly should be able to get the 50 votes that just apply to the states that have recently passed voter suppression laws. Maybe that's what Miles actually means here, but he didn't actually state it in that way. Step 3, Republicans filibuster voting rights. They'd certainly filibuster the John Lewis bill, but with the talking filibuster revived, they'd have to speak nonstop indefinitely to maintain the filibuster and block a vote. They would have to explain over and over again to voters why voting rights laws should be weaker in 2021 than they were in 1965, and why election laws geared toward disenfranchising minority voters should not be reviewed by the Justice Department as they were from 1965 to 2013. While Republicans spout off endlessly from the Senate floor, the racial justice movement would massively mobilize in support of the bill. More and more voters would likely turn against the Republicans as they dog whistled their racist rhetoric from the chambers of our nation's capital. In a recent poll, a significant majority of voters support the key voting rights provisions of the Even Stronger for the People Act. Step 4, change Senate rules to allow a simple majority to end the filibuster on voting rights. After several weeks of a televised spectacle of Republican senators blocking a vote on voting rights with racist speeches as the country watches, it will be time for Joe Manchin to put up or shut up. He will almost certainly have failed in his quixotic quest to round up 10 Republican votes to end the filibuster. He will have to choose between supporting the filibuster and letting voting rights die at the hands of a Republican minority, or changing positions and allowing a simple majority of 50 plus 1 end the filibuster and pass a voting rights bill. Will Manchin want to go down in history as the man who blocked voting rights and supported rule by the minority? To bring Manchin along, Democrats could agree that needing 50 votes instead of 60 to end the filibuster would only apply for the time being to legislation protecting voting rights established by the 14th, 15th, and 19th Amendments to the Constitution. This compromise wouldn't entirely eliminate the 60 vote supermajority needed to end filibusters on all legislation such as immigration reform, but it would limit the supermajority requirement to fewer and fewer types of legislation. The Democrats would then close debate and pass the John Lewis Act with a simple majority. After President Biden signs it into law, career professionals at the Justice Department would start to review voter suppression laws and rule many of them to be illegal and unenforceable as racially discriminatory. Chalk up a win for the good guys. Step 5, bring the For the People Act to the Senate floor. With the rule change allowing a simple majority to end the filibuster on voting rights, Schumer could then bring the more comprehensive For the People Act to the Senate floor. The Republicans will undoubtedly filibuster, but only by speechifying nonstop, not by a secret anonymous email. As a majority of the nation gets fed up with Republican racist dog whistles, the unified Democratic Party could then vote by a simple majority to end the filibuster and pass the For the People Act. In addition to making voter suppression laws enacted by Republican legislatures illegal, it would also replace partisan gerrymandering, in which politicians pick their voters with nonpartisan commissions charged with creating fair voting districts. For example, it would no longer be possible for Wisconsin Republican legislatures to gerrymander the state to win a minority of 45% of the popular vote, compared to 54% for the Democrats, but still control the state assembly by 61 to 38. Step 6, change Senate rules to allow a simple majority to end all filibusters. At this point, the filibuster will have been significantly limited. It has to be a talking filibuster, not a secret silent one. If it concerns voting rights, it can be ended by a simple majority vote. Confirmation of judges and Supreme Court justices already only requires a simple majority. On the reconciliation bills, massive bills on taxes, spending, and the debt limit can also already be passed in the Senate by a simple majority vote. The 60-vote filibuster will increasingly look like an absurd rump. It would still apply to issues like immigration and climate change, to the extent they can't be contorted to fit under reconciliation. But people will ask the obvious question: why does majority rule only apply to judges, voting rights, and money issues, while minority rule applies to everything else, including such major issues as immigration and the environment? With the scope of the minority filibuster so limited, it may then only be a matter of time until it's eliminated completely and the Senate can pass any legislation by majority rule. I think this is a reasonable proposal. I think it would bring a pretty a rapid solution, okay, of the current problems and prepare the way for a rapid end to all filibusters. Certainly by 2023, but should the Democrats win in 2022, which they would have every likelihood of doing if the For the People Act were passed and the John Lewis Act, the Voting Rights Act, okay, were passed, okay, and the reconciliation bills that they are planning to pass, if they would also pass, I think the Democrats would have a great chance to win in 2022 and then be in a position to end all filibusters early in 2023 and just pass legislation in the Senate using a simple majority. So that's an interesting proposal. I would very much like to see it. It's certainly worth discussing, and it's certainly worth formulating objections to, if we can. So I'm going to return now to your comments. Seems like we're almost done for tonight. I do want to remind you of my Patreon account, patreon.com/Joe_Firestone. It's right there. And with that very brief commercial, I will move back to your comments. Evelina says, I did not say people don't want to learn. That was someone else, yes, and that was Kay. Evelina says, Kay, you and I want to learn. Evelina says, hey, Stephen, how are you? Kay says, yes, we do. Evelina says, Steve, not Stephen. Evelina says, other people's comments are coming into my feed. Why? I don't know, Evelina. Says 4 people here on my screen. How many are we all together? We've got all together between YouTube and Facebook. My StreamYard says we got 6 people. Kay says, I only see 4 listed, but others might not have signed in. There might be others on YouTube. Can't read the other 3's comments, assuming the 4th is me, myself, and I. Laugh out loud. Kay says, make them work for it. Oh, there might be some comments coming in also from KRTD Media people, because I've been streaming to them too simultaneously. Evelina says, Facebook shenanigans, I assume, laugh out loud. Evelina says, Aaron Carmen says, why is the Biden administration shielding fascist tiny hands over the Lafayette incident? What the hell is going on with the DOG? Disturbing. I don't know about that. I don't know about the Lafayette incident. Evelyn says, okay, just read your comment, Kay, thank you. Kay says, Beto O'Rourke had a live feed today trying to tell people about the Texas bills concerning voting. Good for Beto. Evelina says, hope he is looking out for his base. He sure is, Evelina. Evelina says she had a huge base when he was running for governor. Wonder what happened there in the end. There was probably some rigging. Stephen Day says, smiles. So we have Stephen Day and Steve Gonzo and Steve Wolfprant here tonight. And Dolores says, mine shows 5 people here on Facebook. Yeah, I can't tell how many are on Facebook. I know I've got 7 now between Facebook, okay, and YouTube. Kay says, Evelyn, I suspect cheating, but it was for the Senate. Yeah, we can have cheating for the Senate too, folks. Okay, I think I'm done for tonight, folks. I want to thank you for coming. Okay, I hope you liked it. I think those thoughts on how the MMT-based capabilities of the federal government can help the states are something that you probably haven't heard much of before. Lana says good night. Good night, Lana. And Dolores says thank you and good night all. Evelina says interesting. Thank you, everyone. And Steve Gonzo says the 3 Stamigos. Kay says, thank you for being here tonight. Was damn sick of MS News. But laugh out loud. But love you all. We love you too, Kay. Thank you for being here tonight. Because it's a holiday weekend. So I feel pretty lucky for you to come tonight. So thanks a lot, everybody, and good night.